This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Graham Redman. The Chronicles of Clovis. Short Stories by Saki. The Peace of Mowsle, Barton. Crefton Lockyer sat at his ease, an ease alike of body and soul, in the little patch of ground, half orchard and half garden, that abutted on the farmyard at Mowsle, Barton. After the stress and noise of long years of city life, the repose and peace of the hill-begirt homestead struck on his senses with an almost dramatic intensity. Time and space seemed to lose their meaning and their abruptness. The minutes slid away into hours, and the meadows and fallows sloped away into middle distance, softly and imperceptibly. Wild weeds of the hedgerow straggled into the flower garden, and wallflowers and garden bushes made counter-raids into farmyard and lane. Sleepy-looking hens and solemn, preoccupied ducks were equally at home in yard, orchard, or roadway. Nothing seemed to belong definitely to anywhere. Even the gates were not necessarily to be found on their hinges. And over the whole scene brooded the sense of a peace that had almost a quality of magic in it. In the afternoon you felt that it had always been afternoon, and must always remain afternoon. In the twilight you knew that it could never have been anything else but twilight. Crefton Lockyer sat at his ease in the rustic seat beneath an old medlar tree, and decided that here was the life anchorage that his mind had so fondly pictured, and that latterly his tired and jarred senses had so often pined for. He would make a permanent lodging-place among these simple, friendly people, gradually increasing the modest comforts with which he would like to surround himself, but falling in as much as possible with their manner of living. As he slowly matured this resolution in his mind, an elderly woman came hobbling with uncertain gait through the orchard. He recognized her as a member of the farm household, the mother, or possibly the mother-in-law, of Mrs. Spurfield, his present landlady, and hastily formulated some pleasant remark to make to her. She forestalled him. "There's a bit of writing chalked up on the door over yonder. What is it?" She spoke in a dull, impersonal manner, as though the question had been on her lips for years and had best be got rid of. Her eyes, however, looked impatiently over Crefton's head at the door of a small barn which formed the outpost of a straggling line of farm buildings. "Martha Pillamon is an old witch," was the announcement that met Crefton's inquiring scrutiny, and he hesitated a moment before giving the statement wider publicity. For all he knew to the contrary, it might be Martha herself to whom he was speaking. It was possible that Mrs. Spurfield's maiden name had been Pillamon, and the gaunt, withered old dame at his side might certainly fulfil local conditions as to the outward aspect of a witch. "It's something about someone called Martha Pillamon," he explained cautiously. "What does it say?" "It's very disrespectful," said Crefton. "It says she's a witch. Such things ought not to be written up." "It's true, every word of it," said his listener with considerable satisfaction, adding as a special descriptive note of her own, "the old toad." And as she hobbled away through the farmyard, she shrilled out in her cracked voice, "Martha Pillamon is an old witch." "Did you hear what she said?" mumbled a weak, angry voice somewhere behind Crefton's shoulder. Turning hastily, he beheld another old crone, thin and yellow and wrinkled, and evidently in a high state of displeasure. Obviously this was Martha Pillamon in person. The orchard seemed to be a favourite promenade for the aged women of the neighbourhood. "'Tis lies, 'tis sinful lies," the weak voice went on. "'Tis Betsy Croot is the old witch, she and her daughter, the dirty rat. I'll put a spell on 'em, the old nuisances." As she limped slowly away, her eye caught the chalk inscription on the barn door. "What's written up there?" she demanded, wheeling round on Crefton. "Vote for Sawker," he responded, with the craven boldness of the practised peacemaker. The old woman grunted, and her mutterings and her faded red shawl lost themselves gradually among the tree trunks. Crefton rose presently and made his way towards the farmhouse. Somehow a good deal of the peace seemed to have slipped out of the atmosphere. The cheery bustle of tea-time in the old farm kitchen, which Crefton had found so agreeable on previous afternoons, seemed to have soured to-day into a certain uneasy melancholy. There was a dull, dragging silence around the board, and the tea itself, when Crefton came to taste it, was a flat, lukewarm concoction that would have driven the spirit of revelry out of a carnival. "It's no use complaining of the tea," said Mrs. Spurfield hastily, as her guest stared with an air of polite inquiry at his cup. "The kettle won't boil, and that's the truth of it." Crefton turned to the hearth, where an unusually fierce fire was banked up under a big black kettle, which sent a thin wreath of steam from its spout, but seemed otherwise to ignore the action of the roaring blaze beneath it. "It's been there more than an hour, and boil it won't," said Mrs. Spurfield, adding by way of complete explanation, "We're bewitched." "It's Martha Pillamon as has done it," chimed in the old mother. "I'll be even with the old toad. I'll put a spell on her." "It must boil in time," protested Crefton, ignoring the suggestions of foul influences. "Perhaps the coal is damp." "It won't boil in time for supper, nor for breakfast tomorrow morning, not if you was to keep the fire a-going all night for it," said Mrs. Spurfield. And it didn't. The household subsisted on fried and baked dishes, and a neighbour obligingly brewed tea and sent it across in a moderately warm condition. "I suppose you'll be leaving us now that things has turned up uncomfortable," Mrs. Spurfield observed at breakfast. "There are folks as deserts one as soon as trouble comes." Crefton hurriedly disclaimed any immediate change of plans. He observed, however, to himself that the earlier heartiness of manner had in a large measure deserted the household. Suspicious looks, sulky silences, or sharp speeches had become the order of the day. As for the old mother, she sat about the kitchen or the garden all day, murmuring threats and spells against Martha Pillamon. There was something alike terrifying and piteous in the spectacle of these frail old morsels of humanity consecrating their last flickering energies to the task of making each other wretched. Hatred seemed to be the one faculty which had survived in undiminished vigour and intensity, where all else was dropping into ordered and symmetrical decay. And the uncanny part of it was that some horrid, unwholesome power seemed to be distilled from their spite and their cursings. No amount of sceptical explanation could remove the undoubted fact that neither kettle nor saucepan would come to boiling point over the hottest fire. Crefton clung as long as possible to the theory of some defect in the coals, but a wood fire gave the same result, and when a small spirit-lamp kettle, which he ordered out by carrier, showed the same obstinate refusal to allow its contents to boil, he felt that he had come suddenly into contact with some unguessed-at and very evil aspect of hidden forces. Miles away, down through an opening in the hills, he could catch glimpses of a road where motor cars sometimes passed, and yet here so little